From the last video then, I have made sure to go into my, I need to make sure that we have added our author name on our stitch page. I also came into the index page and added my author name onto there in a comment block. And then I added the nav just like we did on the stitch page, and I added the footer just like we did on the footer page so that I can maintain consistency across both pages and everything looks like it is part of one combined consistent website. Okay, so now let's continue on our conversation. We're going to talk about something in this video called classes and IDs. And I'm going to start with an ID. So I'm creating a comment block to discuss what an ID is. All right, so to demonstrate an ID, what I'm going to do is use all of this content right here. So I'm going to put all of this content, what we're going to say is wrap it inside a div tag. And so all of this comment, I'm going to move into my div. Div. Okay, make sure that it's all aligned. If it didn't line up properly, remember right click and format document so everything is in proper indentation. All right, so a div was around much longer than a nav or a semantic tag like footer. And what a div used to be all we had, and div simply means a divider. Well, semantically, it doesn't mean anything, but it's still very valid, and we certainly can still use it. So I'm going to use it in this scenario. So again, it doesn't do anything to our website. I'm on my index page, so probably should look at my index page. So I've put a div that's wrapped around all of this content here, but you can't really see anything. It's not doing anything at this point, but it gives me a selector. It also gives me an opportunity to apply an ID. So I'm going to do that with this div. So inside of this open and close angle bracket, I'm going to put something called ID as my attribute, equals, and then in the quotations is something you want to name it. It's similar to a variable name if you want to think about it in that way. It's simply a unique identifier, a unique name for this element. So I'm going to give it the word container because it is a container around these two elements, these three elements. Now this can be whatever you want. I made this word up. You can make it up whatever word you want. So we're going to have ID equals, and in quotations, whatever name you want to provide the ID. Okay, so we've seen selectors being our HTML elements. Well, now a selector can also be our ID. So in order to access an ID as a selector, we have to do it a little bit differently. We're going to, because this is an ID, we select it with the hashtag. So hashtag says, go find an ID with the name that follows. I gave that ID a name of container, and so this would be the selector for this element. So instead of using div, which I could have done, I'm selecting ID equals container. So this is selecting this element via this ID instead of via the HTML tag. So what that means then, if I had another div on this page, which I could potentially, if I were selecting it with the div selector, I would be selecting all of the divs, right? But I'm not in this case. I am, instead of selecting all of the divs, I'm selectively selecting only something that has an ID of container, which happens to be that div. I have too many divs going on here, so let me erase some of this mess that I have going on here. Okay, so now you can put an ID on anything. It doesn't have to be just a div. I could have put it on the nav. I could have put it on an anchor tag. I could have put it inside the H2 tag. You can put an ID on anything that you want to uniquely identify. So I want to uniquely identify this element. So I'm going to give it a name of ID equals container, and then I can access it via the hashtag and the name that I gave it. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me write here the part. It must be unique. It must be unique. There can only be one. And what does that mean? That means that I told you I could put an ID on more than one thing. So I could put an ID on a nav, for example. But here's the problem. Let me go ahead and validate this. It should have a validation error, and it does. What does the validation say? You cannot have a duplicate ID. In other words, I can have more than one ID, and I can put it on any element I want, but I can only have one ID equals container. So in order for this to be valid, I would have to give it something else, like the nav or something else that would make this ID name unique from this ID name. So let's verify now that that does in fact validate. And so now I am validating. So an ID can be put on any element that you want to uniquely identify it from every other element on the page. You can have more than one ID, but what's in the quotation mark is defined by you and can only have one occurrence. I can only have one ID container. Then I select that ID with the hashtag. So utilizing hashtag and the container, the ID name that I gave it, I have this selector and I can apply something to that element. So what am I going to supply to that element? Well, let's see. So this is a block of code. This is a block then that's surrounding all of this content. So remember, anything that I style with the ID container is being applied to this big block, which is surrounding or containing these elements. So let's just play with it and see what we get. So the first thing I'm going to do is going to give it a border. Border and 1 pixel solid. This time I'll give it a different color. I'll give it a blue. So let's see what that gives us. All right. So you should be seeing that we're getting a blue outline around the block, the div that's surrounding our elements here, our H2, our image, and our footer. Can you see that blue line that's surrounding those children? So when we are putting a style on an element, it is surrounding all of this content. All right, so let's add some other things just to keep getting the point across. All right, now what I'm going to do with this block, since this block is taking up this full width, let's make the width smaller. Let's say this width can only be 50% of the page. So now we're going to see that that block is much smaller and it's taking up 50%. Well, it looks like it's cutting into our image a little bit. So let's do 60%. Let's see if that helps clear that up. There we go. Okay. So now we're making this container smaller in width. So it's not taking up the full distance of our web page here. It's just taking up 60% of it. All right, let's try this now. Remember we had text align center. Well, text align center is centering everything, all the children of the body. So it's centering the nav and it's centering the div, but it's not also centering the things inside of it. So what I mean by that is let's just do this. Let's just put in margin auto, and margin auto says make the left side and the right side equal. So make it 60% and then center this entire element into the middle of this. Now the text align is still center, right? The text is still centered, but now our actual element is centered as well using this margin auto. So now our element is being centered with margin auto as opposed to our text was being centered with text align center. Does that make sense? Hopefully. All right, so let's try a couple other things. Let's see. Let's give it a box shadow. So that's being applied to that entire block. Box shadow, we did this already with the header, with the nav. 2 pixels, 5 pixels, 5 pixels, and we'll do a gray. There you go. So you can see that this entire block is getting the text shadow as opposed to individual elements that are children of that block. Okay. And I'm going to do one other thing. Hopefully it's going to show up. I'm going to do a border radius. And we're going to do a 3 pixel radius. Let's see if we can see what that's doing. See how it rounded the corners here of that container? So just kind of cleaner edges. Okay. All right. So if we wanted to carry that over to our stitch, let's just go ahead and try that here. So all we need to do then here is we're going to put a div. Now here's a shortcut. So I could do div div ID equals container. We saw how to do that already. You can also do an emit shortcut, div hashtag, because hashtag means ID, and then the word container, which is the special name that I gave that div. And now I automatically have filled in for me the div ID equals container. So I'm going to take that closing div. I'm going to put it around the footer. I'm going to right click and choose format document. And now we should see that same styling being applied here. So that would be an ID. Now let's look at the word class. Class is very similar. Class is just like an ID, but there can be more than one. So we can select more than one at a time. So let me show you a good example of class. We did this up here where we chose an H2, H3. And so that meant select both the H2 and the H3 and apply this thing. That perfectly works. That's perfectly fine. But another way that we can do the same thing, I'm going to comment this out. So instead of doing it that way, we can use something called classes, which is very similar to an ID. So in the H2, because I'm using H2, I'm going to use the same scenario. H2, I'm going to give it a class equals, and I'll make up a word. I'm going to make up a word upper because I'm going to make these uppercase. So I'm going to add that same class name to the H3. So just like the ID, I'm selecting, I can with my CSS select class names. But this time, instead of using the hashtag, I will use the period notation. Period indicates that I'm referring to a class. And then I give the class name that I'm referring to. But the difference between an ID and a class, besides the dot and the hashtag, is I can have more than one class name. So I can repeat the upper in various places, where the ID I could only have one. So here where we had this font variant, and I said choose an H2 or H3, well, technically I'm doing the same thing here with a class name. So instead I'm saying everything that has a class name of upper is going to have this styling. So this H2 has a class name of upper, and this H3 is a class name of upper. So this selector is selecting all of the elements that match that class name and giving it that same styling. So that would be classes. The difference again is classes can have more than one. An ID can have only one, but you can have many IDs on the page. So that is a discussion of ID and classes.